News, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the American Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have begun to discuss preparations for the summit in Helsinki, which takes place in 2 weeks' time between President Putin and President Trump. Among the topics for discussion will be Syria and the Korean Peninsula, but not Russia's annexation of Crimea, they say. So what can the pair hope to achieve at that summit? Joining me to talk about that are the former foreign correspondent Mary Dejevsky and the journalist political analyst Beth Gardner. Welcome to you both. Well, two world leaders meeting. Is that good news for the world?
Well, I think it's very good news for the world, and I think it's beyond time. Trump came into office with a promise, an election promise, to try to improve relations with Russia. And since he was elected, to everybody's sort of huge surprise, the Washington establishment and Congress, including his own Republicans, have done their absolute utmost to stop this meeting happening. So I think it's honouring an election promise, and it's good for the world.
Well, I think this is obviously an extremely highly anticipated meeting, and I think there's also a tremendous amount of concern around it, as Mary alluded to. And I think the concerns are around not so much the fact of the meeting, but really this sort of strangely conciliatory approach that Trump has always taken towards Putin, really since the earliest days that he came onto the world stage. And a concern about what kinds of concessions he might offer in this meeting, either out of sort of ignorance of the substance of some of the issues, or out of some of the overlap, I think, between his and Putin's worldviews. Obviously this comes at a time when we've seen really pretty unprecedented strain across the Atlantic alliances. We've seen Trump really launching these sort of broadside verbal attacks against NATO, against the EU, against some of our closest allies, Canada, at that recent catastrophic G7 summit in Quebec. We've heard talk of the U.S. potentially trying to pull out of the World Trade Organization as Trump is ramping up his tariffs and potentially towards a trade war. These are the pillars of sort of global stability that America really helped to build after the Second World War in order to constrain the kind of nationalism that led to the war. We've seen Trump attacking those pillars, yes, and that's what, that's Putin's greatest dream.
So there he is, he puts the boot into his allies and meets with the bad guys like Putin and Kim Jong-un.
There is this idea that Putin is all for courting the enemies and forgetting the friends. But
Trump,
I think that's Trump, yes. But I think that's to misunderstand, in a way, what he's about, because it is, in a way, the enemies and the competitors that you do need to court. And I think that Trump, for all the efforts in Washington, this meeting, the very fact that it's going to happen, people talk about it as a coup for Putin. I think almost it's a bigger coup for Trump because of so much opposition. But the idea that he somehow won't know how to handle it, I think that's really quite wrong, because Putin and Trump they've been talking on the phone regularly. They've had two unofficial meetings on the fringes of summits so far. And I think it's time that they got together and discussed. We looked at some of the topics that might be on the agenda. And Syria certainly is a very urgent topic, where Russian and American troops have essentially been practically facing each other in various theatres of war in Syria. And so far there hasn't been a direct clash. But there needs to be something there to prevent that happening at all.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think no one would pick a bone with the notion that you make peace with your adversaries, not with your friends. But I think, as we saw in Singapore with the Kim Jong-un summit, Trump is very ready to sort of not at all engage with the content, he's very interested in the stagecraft and the appearance.
He is a disruptor, and perhaps that's right. Perhaps NATO is an organisation which really needs to look into its soul quite deeply, and perhaps it really doesn't help to have this hostile relationship with Putin, given that he has won elections, which most people accept did reflect the will of the Russian people?
Well, you know, I think we've obviously seen Russia taking a really aggressive stance on the world stage in recent years, you know, with interfering in the American election, the invasion into Crimea, potential interference into other Western elections, not least the suggestions recently that there was some effort to sway the vote here. You know, it's just quite odd to see an American president, as I said, taking such a sort of conciliatory approach towards Russia at this time, rather than trying to push back against some of those you know, forays by Russia. And I think that's why you're seeing such, you know, intense concern right now in some of the Western European capitals as far as, you know, what is Trump going to potentially give away. We've seen him, you know, sort of give some sort of credibility to the notion that maybe the invasion of Crimea wasn't such a bad idea because people speak Russian there. You know, we've seen him so reluctant to acknowledge or in any way sanction Russia over the U.S. election interference. You know, the very reluctant action on his part post the nerve gas attack here. And I think that there's a lot of anxiety in allied capitals about, you know, is America still on our side?
I mean, to put it crudely, the suspicion is that he wants to keep Putin sweet because Putin's got a lot of dope on him.
Yes, I mean, I actually reject that theory. I've seen no evidence whatsoever for that. But I think maybe just to take a slightly different angle for a moment, there is this sort of assumption that Putin is the stronger party here and that he's going to run rings around Trump. But I think there's a sense in which Putin needs this summit at least as much as Trump does. And one of those reasons is that he's trying to introduce at least one very difficult reform at home, which is to raise the pension age, which is going to be very unpopular. And one of the things, amid all the distractions of the World Cup, is that the critics of the pension age range are saying, well, what about all the money we're spending abroad in Syria, to a lesser extent in Ukraine? Wouldn't that be better money spent at home? And, you know, those are exactly the same sort of arguments as you hear in the West about involvement in foreign wars. And I think we discount maybe automatically the idea that Russia has public opinion that can be dangerous for Putin. But I think that Putin does need this sort of boosting from outside, and he realizes that. And I think the idea that Syria especially can be dangerous for Russia, I think Putin needs a settlement there.
OK, well, that's a very interesting point, and I'm sure we'll have you both back to discuss how that summit goes. Thank you for now.